It's a beautiful morning here in Glasgow.
It's a beautiful night here in Los Angeles.
Okay, so that's us. We're now live, and I'm just going to close that down and come back to you. Good morning from Glasgow, Michaelis.
How are you?
I'm very well this morning. I woke up about half an hour ago, so I'm on my first cup of coffee, but all is well in the world. It's uh, it's a gorgeous day here in Glasgow this morning. Tell me, how are you and where are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm in Los Angeles right now. It's about midnight. It's a fantastic time. It's kind of when I wake up, even though I should be sleeping.
Oh
Yeah,
gosh, you're a night owl.
I am. Although I work a lot during the day, so it doesn't really serve me, but I do it anyway.
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. We have mutual friends here in Glasgow who said you would be a an ideal candidate to tell us a wee bit more about you, about your program, about your work. Um, and we're doing a series of interviews over the course of Recovery Month, so you're our very first official interview.
Oh,
Um,
wow. I feel very special right now.
Yeah, yeah,
Well,
you're the first. So thank you so much for joining us. And if you don't mind, do you want to tell us a wee bit about you and how you got into recovery?
yeah, sure. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I was a very awkward child. I had some interesting things happening growing up. Some simple things like my dad leaving me when I was very young, and my mom remarrying a dad who adopted me but didn't really feel emotionally available as a child. I went to a lot of private schools when I was young because my grandparents had some money, even though my actual nuclear family was not very wealthy. And I felt very out of place because everyone I was going to school with was much richer than me. And I was almost like embarrassed to have people come over to my house and play because my house did not look like theirs. And I was also a very paranoid child. I used to like really believe that all the kids were calling each other at 6:30 a.m. to conspire and figure out how they were going to make fun of me that day. I mean, that was kind of like the self-centeredness that I was living in. And I was really insecure. And I would come crying home to my mom basically because kids were making fun of me. And her first advice to me really was to just sort of wear a mask, pretend like they don't hurt you and they'll stop making fun of you. And I just learned to lie very quickly. But eventually it was too much for me. And I'd have like these explosive, outbursts. And then I found my parents' liquor cabinet, and it started very slow. It started with me being, 8 or 9. And there was a lot of alcohol in my family and weed too. But this was kind of like my own drinking. So every family affair, there was alcohol. I was a little kid that snuck around to all the tables and finished everyone else's drink. And my uncle used to take me down into the basement, which I know sounds inherently creepy, but it wasn't. He used to drink scotch with me and talk. And my grandmother used to have her 2 p.m. martinis. And I used to basically squeeze all the gin out of the olives and the onions that were in there because I wanted the alcohol. And but really on my own, my first time really drinking was probably around 8 or 9, where I would sneak into my parents' liquor cabinet, and it wasn't really about a social event. It was more just to shut off the voices in my head that basically told me that I was a piece of shit. And so it was a lot of relief. There weren't a lot of kids in fifth grade having keg parties, so it wasn't really about hanging out by a bonfire, but it was just utilitarian. So that's how it started for me. And basically it just progressed. So I started 8 or 9, and by the end of my use, which was I got sober when I was 22, I was basically manufacturing methamphetamine. So it got bad. uh, between the ages of 19 and 22, I went to jail every single year. So I had big consequences, but I didn't know that I was an addict, and I certainly didn't think I was an alcoholic. So I was in a lot of delusion because a part of me was really enamored by the lifestyle, to be quite honest. I really looked up to gangsters. As a kid, they were my heroes. I always wanted to be a giant drug dealer at this mansion at the top of the hill. And, so I didn't have a lot of this, I don't know, wanting to stop but can't type of situation, or even acknowledgement that my life was a total mess. I mean, the truth is that I was homeless. And I didn't even see it. You know what I mean? I lost my car and my home like years prior, but because I was sort of being floated by these different people in these different houses, I felt like I was doing great. Um, so there's just a lot of delusion. And the last time that I got arrested, like I said, it was for manufacturing methamphetamine. In California back in the 90s, they did this three strike rule. So if you have a violent felony for your first felony, every felony after that becomes a strike. And if you get three strikes, then you get 25 years to life. So I was looking at going to prison for 25 years to life. And I remember they put me in the gang module. And the reason why is because the person that I got arrested with had basically told the other correctional officers that I was threatening his life, which I mean, I really wasn't. I had no part in that. But um, basically, they put me in the gang module, and I was sitting up talking to one of my cellies one night, and I had this revelation that was something that I'd never thought of before, which is, maybe drugs and alcohol are a problem for me. And which is funny because I never considered that. And while I was having that conversation, unbeknownst to me, like my parents had hired a lawyer for me. And across the hall from my lawyer was this guy named Bob Timmons. And Bob Timmons was one of the original Sober Companions. So he used to travel with different bands all over the world on tour and do sober things, and travel with different actors on set and do more sober things. And he happened to be in town this one day that my parents were visiting the lawyer. And he overheard the conversation between my parents and the lawyer. He saw if he could help. He basically came and visited me in Men's County Jail to see whether or not I thought I was an addict. And, before he interviewed me, my parents were like, there's this guy who's going to come visit you. Just tell him that you're an addict because we think that he might be able to get you off. And I was like, okay, I'll tell him. So I conceded that I was an addict, having no idea what that actually meant at the time, and also for years in sobriety. And this guy had a direct relationship with my judge because he had gotten my judge's son sober 2 years prior. So he was able to talk my judge in reducing my sentence from 25 years to life to 6 months in treatment in jail, where I was introduced to the 12 steps, and then just a court commitment to his sober living for about a year. And that's how I was introduced to recovery, basically.
Wow, there's so much there that I identify with, particularly the whole delusion and denial about having had a problem, because it never even occurred to me
Right.
that I might be an alcoholic or addict until I went to my first meeting, and then it was like a ton of bricks dropping. You know, I wanted to just pick up on a couple of things you said there. So one of the things you said was this thought all of a sudden came to you that it might be the alcohol and drugs. And when
It's
we
ridiculous.
I know when we realize these, when we relay these stories to people, they're like, "How can that be?" Like, how can you never have thought that before, or how can you go to your first meeting and then realize, like, and it's like this. Do you think at that point? Because the only explanation I have is a higher power. Do you know what I mean? Like, because there was not a drain or a grain of that thought prior to the thought being revelationary. There was no gradual incremation, it was so what do you think was involved
Yeah,
in that?
I mean, absolutely. I had been living the same bottom for the last 3 years. I mean, I'd been in jail before, I'd been homeless before, I had lost my car, a year and a half before. All my relations had gone to shit. Like everything was bad for a while. So, I mean, absolutely, my whole getting sober, and now I can see it even before I got sober, and basically my whole life I credit to divine intervention and higher power and God, so
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to there was a couple of things I wanted to pick on. The other thing you said was that even in early recovery, you also didn't really know what it meant to be an addict. And, again, that resonates with my own experience. It took me a couple of years, like I was doing Narcotics Anonymous meetings and I would hear, jails, institutions, and death. And I was like, well, I've never been to jail. I've never been to a hospital. And then gradually over time, these wee pennies would drop about, that time that I was arrested and or under caution, nothing happened, but you still went to, the police, Anne-Marie, like they still questioned you. And then that time you ended up in hospital where, you fell and you tore all your ligaments, and then that time you were fighting. Do you know, like, so it was like 2 years sober. And these pennies are dropping, like how could I have sat in meetings for years going, well, I've never been to hospital and I've never been, like
Totally.
so yeah, tell me a wee bit about that, not knowing, you're sober, but you don't really know what you're suffering from.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I related to everything that people were saying. I mean, I related to the jails, I related to the institutions, I related to death, basically. I OD'd on my 21st birthday. But, and I related to the feelings that people talked about, feeling uncomfortable in their own skin, feeling like a mouth without or a screen without a mouth, I think is the words. I related to, not being able to trust my thinking, making poor decisions, all that stuff I related to. And what I later found out was that's not actually what defines me as a addict. And it wasn't really till someone took the time to teach me the big book, basically. And then also what was different about this time, because I had been sober for 9.5 years before someone taught me the big book in this very specific way. And I'd read the big book before and I, got sober actually or clean in NA. So I had experience with that fellowship as well. But yeah, for some reason, what was different was the guy who took me through the book. So how it worked was he had me meet him at his apartment at, Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. And we would work for an hour and we'd start from the front cover till whatever we can get done in an hour. And I remember after finishing my first session with him, I said, okay, cool. What do I do now? Do I call you every day? Do I need to do some writing, like the typical sponsee stuff? And he said, no, I just want you to pass on what I've just passed on to you to as many people as you possibly can. My reaction was like, you're out of your fucking mind. I mean, we haven't even read the text yet. We're like, we just drew some symbols and shit, talked about it, wrote some prayers or whatever. And he said, well, what does it mean to work the program? And we had just gone over the circle and triangle. I was like, well, it's working with others. He's like, well, if you want to work the program, work with others. And it was through the repetitive going through the doctor's opinion, not just with him, but with all the people that I'd worked with, that really allowed me to truly see what addiction is. And I think truthfully, without having a good knowledge of the doctor's opinion, you don't even really know what you're suffering from. We can't really even admit what we're powerless over in the first step. And I think the fellowship twists it all into this like psychobabble, like, I have a personality disorder type shit, when really it's as simple as I have a abnormal reaction to drugs and alcohol. When I put drugs and alcohol in my body, I can't control what happens next, and over any considerable period of time, it gets worse, never better. And the other thing about that abnormal reaction is that it's never going away, which, that's the issue. And that's really the only piece that really distinguishes me from every other human being on this earth. I think that a lot of the human condition stuff gets thrown underneath the umbrella of addiction. And I think that that's irresponsible, actually, because the book talks about us being recovered from this thing. But when you throw all this human condition stuff underneath that umbrella, when do you ever recover? I mean, the human condition is like a lifelong practice. So, to say in my sobriety that my validation seeking issues or my alcoholism, my addiction, that's not true. That's just a human being, right? So that's where I actually really learned about it. And, prior to that, and prior to working with people every single day, because since I've worked with that guy, I've basically been in the big book with 1 to 9 people every single day. And that's been for the last 15 and a half years. So that's actually changed the entire trajectory of my life. And prior to that, I tried to kill myself at 5.5 years sober, and I tried to kill myself again and at 6.5 years sober. And it's because I wasn't working the program, and I was just becoming a slave to the human condition and all the symptoms of self. And it was, driving me insane.
Yeah, thank you. I really understand what you're saying, and maybe people who are listening won't. There's quite a lot to unpick there. So, first of all, I heard you talk about the allergy concept, which when I first came in was a life raft for me because I had never drank or took drugs, but I can really identify it particularly with alcohol, that once I put alcohol into my system, so I had this sort of mental obsession that it was the solution. Like you said, I was very young as well. That struck me when you were talking 9 years old, and I'm a mother now of a 22-year-old son. And I remember my son growing up and I had my first drink at 11 and looking at him when he was 11 and thinking, oh my God, he's such a baby, but that mental obsession after that first ever experience with alcohol, I got a job in order to buy cider. That was my whole motivation for getting a job. I started stealing as well in order to get money to buy, what would have been cider at 12 years old. Um, but that phenomenon of craving, like once I put alcohol in, it was insatiable. It was like it released this beast basically who needed more. And I also had that experience with different drugs. It was this absolutely ferocious craving, and it didn't matter how much I put in, it actually made the craving for it. It just exacerbated it. It illuminated the craving got stronger the more I used. And I think that's very, very difficult for people to understand. And the allergy concept is a useful way of explaining it, right?
Totally. And I mean, the truth is that a a lot of people who talk about alcoholism or addiction, they don't really define it as the allergy. And people who've never experienced the allergy can't even conceive that it exists. And
Yeah.
so I think there's a lot of people in the fellowship who are actually misdiagnosed alcoholic or addict because they got physically addicted to a specific compound because of the nature of the drug itself, but they're not really allergic, you know, because the allergy is not substance specific. And that's where you see people who, basically use heroin for 10 years and then get off, they go into treatment, they detox, they get sober. And then a few years later, they're able to drink normally. And then they think that addiction was just that piece of their life. And a real addict or a real alcoholic, that's not just a piece, that is for life. So I think being able to really comb through people's drug and alcohol use, all of it, to help them see whether or not they're the allergic type is the most important thing. Because I don't think that everybody, needs to be in Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or Cocaine Anonymous or any of those substance specific anonymous programs.
Yeah.
Because of that. And I think it's actually dangerous to have people there because those programs require abstinence. And if you have these people who've been sober for a long time, but then are doing ayahuasca to next level their spiritual awakening, and they're able to do that, and now they're recommending the people they work with, oh, I tried this ayahuasca thing, you should do that. And luckily I've worked with enough people because I considered that maybe ayahuasca might be okay. I've never done it before. I've done plenty of hallucinogens, but ayahuasca wasn't one of them. But I started working with people, especially nowadays, who've done ayahuasca, and their plan was to do it one time a year to have this journey, and then it was like, oh no, I'm going to do it 6 months later. Oh, no, I'm going to do it 3 months later, and then it's like, oh wait, I'm going to do ketamine too, and then all of a sudden they're trying to order Oxycontin from Germany to have it mailed to their house because they're on a full blown run because they actually triggered the allergy because they have it, and some people don't understand that. And the people that are most vehemently against 12 step are typically people who've been misdiagnosed. And I think the dogma and the fellowship puts them off, and then they have a resentment not against the program but against the people.
Yeah.
You know, that's what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot actually, people who don't, like for me, when I used that, I never stopped using until I either passed out or my money ran out.
Mm.
And because I was a thief, or I would put myself into positions where um I was surrounded by, alcohol and other drugs. It was rare for that to happen. So I know that I am the variety of addict as explained in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I think when we are taking people through the book, that is a crucial point where we identify, which type are you? Are you the type that has to arrest this and it's absolutely dependent on your spiritual condition, whether or not you're going to keep it arrested and like you say, passing it on. And that's another thread I wanted to pick up on. You mentioned, the depth of understanding not just the condition itself, but also your own spiritual growth and freedom, and that coming about as a result of working with others. Can you tell me a wee bit more about that?
Yeah, you ready to sit back? Okay. So, you talked about mental obsession earlier, and the mental obsession is really purely just the ability to believe a lie. The end game lie that I believe as an allergic type, an alcoholic, or an addict is that I don't have the allergy, which is why I would continue to go back and use, right? Thinking it'll be different this time. Even the people that say, well, I know that I'm going to go back and it's going to get bad. My question to them is, well, if you know it's going to get bad, why don't you just blow your brains out and skip to the chase? There must be a part of you that's deluding yourself to thinking that you're going to make it back if you pick up, you know? So it's still that lie that I don't have this allergy, right? But if you look at the ability to believe a lie, that's not distinct to alcoholics or addicts. Every human being has the ability to believe a lie. I mean, if anybody questions that, just go on to social media. You'll literally see people lying to themselves all day, right? And, I was watching a TikTok video the other day, and this girl was like sitting her car in a car park, and she's filming this video and she's like in tears and sharing about all this anxiety about this shit that's happening over in the Middle East. And I'm looking at her film this video and I'm like, you're in a fucking car, in a car park. There is literally no Middle East where you are right now, but you are fostering all this emotion. So, I mean, the ability to believe a lie is the inability to be in the truth. And the only truth that I'm absolutely sure of is the moment that's in front of me, because everything outside of this moment is literally, I have no idea what's happening. So the truth is now, right? And that's like kind of what they're talking about in the big book when they're talking about us launching ourselves into the fourth dimension of existence, right? That's really the intersection of space and time, which is the absolute now. And they describe that as that's where heaven on earth can be found, right? So if I think about right now, it's like there's no war happening right now. There's no sickness. There's no politics. There's nothing happening right now. I'm sitting here talking to you, you know? So any story that I would tell myself outside of this moment is essentially a lie. It's a fantasy, right? So there's that piece. And then we have the spiritual malady. And the spiritual malady is described in all kinds of very strange ways in the fellowship. Like, and it sounds poetic. And I think just people parrot shit because it sounds cool. But like, people talk about it being like a God-sized hole that you're trying to fit a bunch of other shit into. But I don't know, if you step away from that statement, it just sounds inappropriate. It doesn't age well. But the spiritual malady is just emotional unmanageability. So it's the anxieties, the depression, the worry, the jealousy, the anger, feeling lost, feeling purposeless, feeling alone in a room full of people that love you, feeling basically like the universe gave every person on this earth a manual about, about how to function and exist successfully. But God was like, fuck you, figure it out, Now, I think it's very self-centered when alcoholics and addicts think they're the only ones who feel that way. Every human being goes through that. They've created a whole book called the DSM-5 that is that, right? Hello, therapists. Sorry. Which is so funny. There's all these diagnoses for disorders, but there's no like standard of normal, right? Because it doesn't fucking exist. So that's also human condition. Now, the way it all works together is, very simple. It's like I believe a story in my head that's not rooted in truth. It elicits a negative emotional response. Now the story feels real because I have a feeling about it. And that's just, if there's no intervention, it just continues to snowball and snowball. It's all in the guy who wakes up in the morning in my bed and I open up my eyes and I think, Mikhail's, you're a piece of shit. Your wife's going to leave you. You're a fucking fraud. The world's going to end. Um, you know, Maybe those people who are doing ayahuasca are onto something, or maybe those people who are microdosing mushrooms and ketamine are onto something. They're taking it in a doctor's office. That person's certified. Maybe my body's going to know the difference because the person who's handing me the drugs I used to get high off of is wearing a fucking lab coat, right? Or I just say fuck it, and then I get high, and then as soon as I put that drugs and alcohol in my body, I'm done. So really, like, once I'm sober and the drugs and alcohol are removed, the allergy I'm recovered from, that's done. But I'm dealing with the human condition, which is what makes life so fucking miserable, right? And when that's not treated, I'm fucked. And it's really the spiritual malady and how I treat that spiritual malady that, really gives me peace and freedom, right? Because I have to treat my body, I have to treat my mind, and I have to treat my spirit. The way I treat my body is very simple. I just hang out with other sober members of the fellowship, right? The way I treat my mind is, with the recovery. Recovery is not found in the meetings. Recovery is not found out of the sponsor. Recovery is not found out of the speaker. If I want to go to the purest, most original, integral form of recovery, it's going to be in the book because that book is the only thing that I know that's, yielding millions of recoveries all over the world and hasn't been changed since it was written because that shit works, And the way that it treats my mind is it's a diagnostic tool. It deep dives into the allergy. It also deep dives into all the thinking that precedes a relapse in the drinking. So if I'm in that book every single day with another human being talking about my allergy and their allergy and my thoughts and their thoughts, then I'm not going to believe the lie that, oh, I can have a drink and drug because it's fresh in my mind. That built-in forgetter is dying of neglect, right? But also because of the way that book is intended to be read, because it's a textbook. Textbooks are found in schools. In schools, there's teachers and there's students. So that means that like that book needs to be a partnered reading experience. It's not something that I just read on my own. Now, when I'm engaged in conversation with another human being over that book, I'm not thinking about my future. I'm not thinking about my past. I'm thinking about the conversation. So I'm launched into the present. If I'm launched into the present, I'm existing in the truth. So even the ability to believe a lie as a human being starts also dying in neglect, where honesty no longer is rooted in perception for me anymore. It's more synonymous with truth, with now, right? And that's where peace exists. So the spiritual malady is treated with the service side of the triangle, right? Now, service needs to be selfless, and really, service is the way to live in conscious contact with or gain access to the power of my God, right? The one that I picked. And again, like when we talk about how I got sober and divine intervention, essentially I'm acknowledging, oh shit, there is a power that is loving me unconditionally, taking care of me unconditionally, and wanting the best for me unconditionally. So to connect to that, right? Because essentially all those things are almost acknowledging a universal power that's serving me at all times. The best way to develop a relationship with the servant is just practice being the servant. And then also, the reason why that gives me an unlimited well of power is that if I'm just trying to be the blessing to every single moment and every person in that moment without expectation of reciprocation, because remember, my God is unconditional, then nobody can fuck with me. If I don't want anything from you, you can't mess with my emotional stability, right? Because I'm just doing it because it's divine purpose. It's not to get a reaction from you or appreciation from you or for you to do something for me later or whatever. I know I'm being taken care of. So but that's the kind of like selflessness I need to be in. I need to treat my mind and my body simultaneously. Then the most rudimentary, simple practice that I've ever known, which is like the simplicity of what this dude told me, was just pass the book on to other people. And really all I'm teaching people is how to teach the book. And really all I'm teaching them in that context is, oh, underline this, highlight this, circle this, write this little note. But really it's just about the conversation that happens. And in that space, there's no longer this like, hierarchical, authoritative, sponsored, fucking codependent bullshit. It's just two people talking and connecting to each other, connecting to the moment. And if God is everything and I'm connecting to you, then I'm connecting to God, right? And if it's in the spirit of unconditional love, then self starts to slip away over time. And, self is really the root of all my troubles. That's what puts me in a lack of power position is operating from the place of self. But like I said, if I'm just being in selflessness, then I have all the power in all the situations. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes total sense. It's how I live my life. But hey, I loved your description there of that thing about, when you're in the moment, when you're doing something. Like I had somebody approach me yesterday and they were quite shocked at the lengths I was willing to go to help them. And like you, I was just in the moment. Well, this is here, this is what I can do now for you. Um, and he immediately went into and I'll do this and I'll do it. And I was like, that is not important. It's not important that you reciprocate. It's important for me to give. Um, Although there has been a big theme in my recovery where it has been difficult to receive,
Mm.
like so I'm much more comfortable in the giving position. And that's for the most part because I have so much to give. It's not
Question,
because, you
like
know,
receive tangibly or receive like emotional love from people? Like, what do you mean?
in the context of yesterday's conversation, it was around, like the work that we're involved in the sector, and I'll do this at some point in the future. And I was like, that means nothing to me. All that's important is right here, right now. If that comes off, that's great. And there's been many times, I've worked in the sector for a long time where people have said this, and this, and we'll do this, and we'll do that. And it hasn't came off. In fact, probably about 5% of what I've gave over the years has been reciprocated. But and that's only a calculation that I thought of yesterday. It's not a calculation that I'm conscious of. Um, and it was only because it was so starkly put in front of me yesterday. But like you said, the important thing is to pass on immediately. And I take that not just from, through my experience of working with other women going through the book, that now is part of my everyday life. It's part of my exchange with, the women at the supermarket, the women at the bus stop, the women in the shop, like it's I'm a practicing Catholic, so everybody in the moment, I'm very, like you said, wanting to be the blessing, where can I be of service, be the servant, always my, yeah. And what a privilege to be in, what a privileged position to be in to serve, right?
Yeah, we're uniquely qualified. I mean, I understand now why people used to say, "Hi, my name is so and so. I'm a grateful alcoholic." When I first heard that, I was like, "Grateful for what?"
Mm.
But because I had this thing, and now I have this path because of this thing, and now I have like the opportunity to be of service, and now there are rooms all over my city where people with my same affliction gather for me to tap into to be of service to. My life is easy. Like, I have the simplest way of getting outside of self. So what? I read a book that was already written for me and pass on underlines and highlights that were given to me. I mean, that's like, it doesn't get any easier than that. And the gift is so epic in terms of the freedom and peace that comes from just having a daily practice of getting outside of self. It's like that line in the book that says, what seemed a flimsy reed proved to be the loving and powerful hand of God. You know what I mean? It's like reading a book with someone sounds fucking so dumb. It's so dumb, but it works. I've gotten more from that than anything else in my life. And truthfully, it's allowed me to enjoy every aspect of my life too. And I was in the music industry. I had people promising me like the world a million times over. And I'm exactly like you, where it's like, cool. I'm enjoying this experience with you. That shit happens, great. If it doesn't, I don't really care, you know?
And
So,
what would you say to sort of anyone listening who thinks, oh, these two just sound like absolute cult members? They're obsessed with a book, they're indoctrinated, they're ideologues,
ah,
they're
yes. So this is my favorite people, right? Um, I talk to these people all the time, actually. In fact, like, there's some people on TikTok who you would think would be my enemies, but like, and I've reached out to them and I've had conversation with them, and we actually get along really well. And when they hear my ideas about this, which really aren't my ideas, know, they even extend beyond 12 steps existence. They can't really argue it, you know? So, look, I think that the reason why AA gets this, or NA or whatever, gets this sort of like cult rep is that there are people in the fellowship that are culty, you
yeah,
know, 100%. There's people who are trying to elevate themselves as gurus, and there's people who are worshiping other people as gurus, you know, even the people who are like, oh, Bill Wilson forever type shit, and ignoring the fact that that fool relapsed and he was a mess. Like, come on, we're all human beings, right? But what destroys the cult thing here, and what destroyed it even with the guy that took me through the book, was one of the things we write on our very first page is this process is not to make me depend on the sponsor, is
mm,
to enable me to become dependent upon God. A sponsor can't save themselves. So really it just humanized the thing. So like even with the circle and triangle, he said, okay, cool. When you're feeling fucked up in sobriety, what are you going to do? You know, and I always was taught to call my sponsor. He's like, well, what makes you feel that way in sobriety when you're feeling uncomfortable? I'm like, well, it's mental obsession and spiritual malady. He's like, well, how do you treat that? Take someone through the book. So really, it's not even about the book itself. Like I don't worship. That's the next thing we write in the book. This book is not to be worshipped like other human resources. Only my God, or my concept of, God, or basically the practice of unconditional love is the only relationship that I should pedestal above everything else, right? So it's not really about human dependence at all. And in fact, and if anyone calls me with a problem, my first question to them is, who have you worked with today? Who have you taken through the book today? So it's, I'm not telling anybody how to live their lives. I'm not telling people to call me at a certain time of day. I'm not telling them to go to this many meetings or not be in that relationship or not do that job, or I don't tell anybody shit. Basically, all I'm doing is giving people a practice to like have on their own to develop their own relationship with a power greater than self.
yeah.
Um, so I don't see anything culty about that at all. It's actually the opposite. It's kind of the anarchist way, and it's actually going against the grain from all the shit that you hear in the fellowship.
Yeah.
Is
But
basically sorry.
I'm just laughing because I'm thinking back to my early recovery, working through the service structure and learning
Oh,
about the traditions. And you mentioned the word anarchy, and it was organized anarchy. Like it was anarchy in its most beautiful form, and like this idea that we would have gurus. Where I got clean in London, there was something called the Joys of Recovery meetings, and they were those guys who were suited and booted, and you had to phone five people a day, and you had to talk to your sponsor at a certain time, and you weren't allowed to share in a meeting till this and that. And that was, I attended those meetings, but my actual home group was a bread and butter meeting and
right.
Toot and Beck. So I had, those old school guys who knew the book, and these sorry, I don't know why my wee hand came up there.
That's
Um
cool.
so I had the experience of watching that stuff going on and thinking, what is that? So I do know that those types of figures do exist in certain aspects of the fellowship, but they're and what you said about, the whole purpose of the book is to get a relationship with a God of your understanding. So that,
Totally.
this claim, although I've been clean and sober for 27 years, thank God. And I've did a huge exploration during that time of different philosophies, ideologies, practices, and I've landed back where God planted me in Catholicism. I mean, it's so rich. I'm getting so much out of it. But I would never, like one of the mainstays of this, my understanding of this book and this program is that it's for you to develop your relationship with your God, and the freedom of that was absolutely necessary. Like if you had to say this has to be a Christian God or a Muslim God or, whatever it has to be, I wouldn't have stayed. I wouldn't have came back, right?
Right. Yeah, totally. And if you zoom out of every single monotheistic or polytheistic religion or spiritual practice and the 12 steps, it's all saying the same shit. It's all rooted in selflessness. It's all rooted in unconditional love.
Yeah.
Granted, things have branched off and gotten weird at certain points, but that's the base foundation of all that stuff. So,
And you spoke at the beginning as well, Michaelis, about this sort of pathologizingness of the human condition, like the DSM-5 and all the different personality disorders. And, you know, can you take me back a wee bit about, so I want to hear two things. I want to hear about your work and actually about the success rates of people now coming to the fellowship and why the sort of modern world, and I'm seeing a big influx of, ADHD medications and various autistic diagnoses starting to happen. Could you maybe sort of talk about that a wee bit more? Give me your thoughts on that.
yeah, this is going to be really controversial. Okay, cool. I think a lot of that shit is just bullshit. I think everybody's on the spectrum of everything, essentially. I think there are certain disorders that are more severe than others. There's some schizoaffective disorder, multiple personality stuff that I think is, you know, obvious, but like bipolar, ADHD, manic depressive, depression, anxiety, just like your run of the mill, what a lot of people seem to, narcissism, like all that stuff, borderline. I really think that all that stuff is just symptoms of self expressing themselves in different ways. I think the diagnosis is really just people attempting to try to understand things and to monetize it either through sessions or medication, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
And why is that so dangerous for alcoholics and addicts in recovery?
well, a few reasons. Number one is, and it's not just alcoholics and addicts in recovery. I think a lot of people wear their diagnosis as almost like a badge of damage and also weaponize it against people who are trying to help them or might suggest a different path. I think that the medications for some of this stuff are not great for people. Um, of course, I'm not anti-medication, nor do I think, uh, oh man, I have some different views on this shit. Actually, I'm not anti-meds, and I don't care what people do if it makes them happy. I just think I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was, I don't know, 16, 17. And it was right after me and my mom tried to commit suicide together. She was put into the category of chronic depression, and I was put into the category of ADHD because back in the mid 90s, it was a popular diagnosis. I'm sure if it was 10 or 15 years later, I would have been diagnosed bipolar or whatever. She would have been diagnosed borderline because I feel like diagnoses kind of are these fad type things. But I was put on Ritalin, and basically, I mean, it was speed. It let me know that, oh shit, I like speed. And then before I know it, I was like crushing at my Ritalin and snorting it and selling Ritalin and trying to get other stuff. And, you know, I think that the pharmaceutical industry and also the psychiatric industry is selling people a limiting belief. I think people are way more powerful than people want to give them credit for, and that's people have the power to heal. And I think that when you simplify it as a symptom of self, it actually puts the responsibility in people's hands to be in a selfless practice. But when you don't do that and you have all these different varying diagnoses and give them pills, they don't have to work. They can just take the pill and they're chilling, you know? So in terms
Well,
of
well,
addict,
that would be helpful if the pills worked, right? But
well,
more often than not, the pills don't work, right?
totally. So that's the other thing. Like, I don't, for people who have the allergy, I don't think anything like Adderall, Strattera, Concerta, like the ADHD medication, is a viable solution because of that. And also, even in the DSM-5, it says like you can't properly diagnose someone ADHD with substance abuse disorder, you know? So I think a lot of people don't pay attention to that. But then also, I think that, and really what I'm talking about in terms of the problem is like, let's say someone goes into detox and they're coming off of fentanyl, right? And they give them subs, but because of the insurance companies, they need to have all these other diagnoses to justify days paid at the treatment center. So you wind up having these people that were like using fentanyl out in the world, but walking out with 20 different bubble packs of medications for psychiatric stuff, you know, and like seven of those are comfort meds, like Seroquel for sleep and Trazodone for sleep and hydroxyzine for anti-anxiety and gabapentin for anti-anxiety. Like it's just fucking crazy. So, you know, you have these people walking around like zombies and not even knowing it and really thinking that they're putting their best effort forward because they think that they're sober because they're not on the fentanyl and they're just in a cloud and it takes them making their own conscious decision to get off of that stuff on their own initiative for them to actually even see that they're in a cloud. But then you get to this, you know, piece in the book where it's like it says a man's brain must be clear before he has a better chance of understanding and accepting what we have to offer. And I think that that's true with a lot of that stuff. Like, I've run a lot of groups with a lot of people over the years. And when someone is on Suboxone, for instance, first of all, their, or even the supplicate shot, their ability to stay awake in the group is hampered. Let alone like if we are having a more confrontational conversation where it's about them getting honest, I found that it's difficult for people to get honest. I don't know what it does to the brain exactly because I'm not a doctor, but I do think that that stuff impairs people's thinking or ability to really connect to like what's actually going on with them. And, you know, I think a lot of people are like stoked because they're not out in the world stealing shit and they're not, you know, jamming dirty needles into their body. And that's a win, I guess. But I mean, to me, being a walking zombie who can basically hold a job and function doesn't really seem like a win. And that's a limiting belief thing I'm talking about.
Michaelis, can you just pause for 1 minute? There's someone at my door. I really want to explore this topic. So
Oh
bear
boy.
with me. Bear with me.
Okay.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for that. And
You
thank you for being willing to explore this because I think it's a vital conversation. I understand that people are reticent to talk about it because they are seen as being, somehow if you're questioning the use of a diagnosis or a medication that you're being seen as somehow not compassionate or judgmental or old-fashioned and at risk of, let's face it, severe cancellation if you are particularly working in the industry in some way or working in, this is such a fine, there's such a fine balance between, looking after each other's mental health and co-signing any sort of addictive behavior, that or any sort of behavior that would lead to or beliefs that can lead back into addiction. I've seen it happen really strongly in the last couple of years in Glasgow. There's been a wave of social contagion around ADHD meds within
Yeah.
the recovery community, and it does become like an identity, this I'm neurodiverse stuff. And
Um,
and this is happening to people in long-term recovery. I'm watching people fall like dominoes, and turn into, like full-blown using addicts again, like, and
yeah.
it's quite considerable to
I
watch it.
mean, it's the same thing that was happening in the early 90s and late 80s, where, prior to that, and this is probably part of the problem of not, okay. So, how like the singleness of purpose thing, we don't talk about drugs in AA meetings, right? First of all, that's the biggest fucking bullshit ever. And the reason why is number one, the drugs is mentioned so many times in the big book. Dr. Silkworth was like, treating drug and alcoholic addiction. It was underneath the same umbrella. And, unfortunately, Bill decided to go do acid at 20 years of sobriety under the delusion that he wanted to, elicit a spiritual experience for people who were in detox. Meanwhile, he had 20 years. He has no business to be experimenting with that. Unless he just says, I want to be out, I'm relapsing. But because they're protecting that, a year later, he gets out at a conference and talks about singleness of purpose. We only talk about alcohol at Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, which just seems really convenient. So, granted, people get yelled at for talking about drugs at AA meetings. I'm talking about in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and you have all these people starting to get being prescribed pain pills, anxiety medication, and it took people a while to figure out that that shit was fucking people up. People were going out on that stuff. So I think the same thing is going to happen with all these new sort of psychotherapeutic medications as well. It's just going to take time. And I think the reason why people are trepidatious about this topic is, I mean, first of all, you're asking me these questions, so I'm telling you my honest opinion, and my honest opinion that's rooted in experience of like being in the treatment industry for like 25 years, seeing a bunch of people, working with a bunch of people. But I'm not talking about this as a representative of AA, nor am I talking about this as in the context of how I work with people. I work with people who are on ADHD medications, and I work with people who are on gabapentin and, all these different things because that's the nature of our culture right now. But
And it is very much our culture, isn't it? I've got a sponsee who's also on ADHD medication, and the cultural influence has definitely got impact on and I think going back to Bill Wilson, and I want to stick up for Bill a wee bit here, in his use of acid, and that when he experimented with it, or relapse, and I would agree that is absolutely a relapse. It was before the whole, drop out, tune out, it was before the whole Timothy Leary, and before it became seen as a kind of hippie drug. So at the time that Bill did it, it was being touted as a sort of medication or a potential medication um for depression, and he was prone, as we know from the book, to misery and depression. But also going back to, what you were saying about, oh gosh, I've lost my train of thought.
can
So
I
yeah,
interject?
oh no, no, well, oh yeah, barbiturates and narcotics, like anybody who's in an AA meeting and saying we don't talk about drugs hasn't read the book. Do you know
right
what I mean?
now.
Both Bill and Bob were drug addicts, you know, like it was very, very, it's all there in the book. So that's always been, I've always been a member of both fellowships, you know, and or, you know, just by saying that I'm breaking the traditions, of course. But and you know, I'm not like you, I'm not claiming to be representative of the fellowships. I'm just, you know, wanting to make recovery visible. Generally when I speak about it, I say, uh, you know, that I'm a member of a 12-step fellowship. I don't usually identify which one it is. So that sort of keeps me right around the traditions. But, you know, I'll have always been a member of both. And I think that has served me very, very well. Because like you have seen, like when I first got clean and sober, a lot of old timers in AA who were on high dose pain meds who
Mhm.
were dribbling, you know, they were spilling
Totally.
tea, they were dribbling, you know.
Yeah.
And I can see this new wave of cultural influence coming in around identitarian politics and, you know, that medication and the whole, you know, the pharmaceutical industry is very strongly associated with a lot of different identitarian issues. So the cultural influence on our book and the ability of our book and our program to help people, it seems to be like, you know, well, obviously for you and me, there was a complete surrender at some point, you know, that we realized that the culture and the material world were something to be avoided.
Right.
It was something we had to put up with while we were here. But actually the peace and the joy and the, you know, the love was based on the spiritual realm. And it was that we had to continually access every day with each other, right?
And it's so simple. And I mean, I'm speaking from being a human who was diagnosed with ADHD, who's tried to commit suicide multiple times. Chronic depression runs my family. My whole family was meted up on antidepressants. So, even when I was put in the psych ward when I was like 5.5 years sober, they put me on Lexapro and they tried to put me on Seroquel for a minute. And while I was in the hospital, I had to take it. But when I came out, like, I mean, truthfully, that shit fucked me up. Like, I was not sober. Like, it didn't feel sober, Seroquel. And it's just an antipsychotic, but it's got sedative properties, right? So I got off of it as soon as I got out of that place, which was in like 2 days. But the Lexapro I took, and I took it for about 3 or 4 months, and I kind of felt like a shell of myself, to be quite honest with you. And I just didn't like it. And I got off of it, which I would never recommend just cold turkeying that stuff because it sent me right back into a suicidal ideation. So I should have weaned off it, but I just could not deal with that stuff. But yeah, I don't think the pharmaceutical industry as a whole is horrible. I think that they produce a lot of good medications for people out there. I think in just terms of like a lot of mental health stuff, it's not amazing how things are pitched to people, where the pill is pitched as the solution rather than the temporary intervention.
Yeah.
Even with like Suboxone and some of the MAT medications, like great, detox, cool, but and if it's your journey to recovery, great. And however that looks for you, cool. But I think selling it to people as the solution and this is what you need to be on for life. Because if you're not, you're going to relapse, or if you're not, you're going to have some sort of breakdown or whatever. I think that
Yeah.
that's insane.
Yeah, it's this idea that it's a chronic relapsing condition that it has to be managed for the rest of your life that just doesn't resonate, you know, with my experience at all. You know, like I've been clean and sober and not had to take any medication. There was a brief period after my son was born, I think for maybe somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks, where, you know, through absolute fear and exhaustion, I relented and took an antidepressant. It was like a Prozac type medication, the one of the generics. But like you, I quickly found that it wasn't. It didn't. I didn't feel like me, and I came off it again. You know, and it was just when I look back at that time and when I inventoried it soon afterwards, I could see that it was, you know, just fear, absolute fear of being a new mum and being on my own. That was
Which is
like
natural.
Yeah, I was completely wired, yeah. And again, that goes back to that pathologizing the human condition. And like you know, I think there, like for instance, like from a therapeutic point of view, um, there are certain medications, you know, if I'm working with a sponsee or you know, like there's certain medications where that work just I can't we're not connecting. It's not getting done because they're sedated or they're detached, you know, and for some people, of course, that will need to be the case, you know, and I'm sure, you know, and I don't know who those people are, but there's a depth of work that is unavailable when you're sedated. You know, like there's a depth of healing that you cannot reach when you're sedated, and there are much better drugs like you. I think the pharmaceutical industry does a great job in certain areas. Even with Suboxone, you know, there's a Buvidal preparation here. You know, like you're very cognitively available but you're still, you know, you're still held as far as, you know, your addiction you can't use on top, or you certainly can't use any opiates on top when you use it. And it's a much better drug than some of the other drugs, you know, that
Oh,
are used as substitutions. So yeah, it's quite a lot of territory to navigate, isn't it?
yeah, it is a lot. All I know is that the people that I know who have made the decision to get off of some of these medications and sobriety, all their feedback has been I notice a difference in terms of my clarity and just my connection to life. And everybody that I know that who's continued thinks that they are clear as day, you know?
Yeah.
So it's just, yeah, it's an interesting
Yeah. I've just
situation.
I've just walked beside somebody as they have withdrawn from um I don't know how many years actually, more than a decade's worth of antidepressants, and she sweated for at least 4 months. You know, every time I met her, she was pouring with sweat, and these were just very simple antidepressants. She couldn't sleep. She was, you know, restless leg syndrome. But she did it, you know, and she's there, and she, you know, she's living her best life, and I know that's not the journey for everybody. But and I never encouraged her to do that. I said I would walk beside her while she did it. You know, there's totally non-judgmental sort of attitude from me overall. And it, you know, like I like you, I'm like, I don't care if you use drugs or not.
I don't care either.
No, I don't care. Like, but
Makes no difference.
yeah, it's like there's a healing available here if you want it. You know, if you want to access it, it's going to be hard work. But I wouldn't like you, I wouldn't swap it for the world, you know. And why do you think like the success rates of where we started, you know, like you look at the book, it says, you know, the success rates were really high. Why do you think that's dropped off?
Oh, it's because the fellowship is fucked. And that's part of the problem too. And this is why, like, I think a lot of people choose to be medicated is because the message that you get at the fellowship is so fucked up and so off brand that people are not getting relief sober, right? I mean, pretty much at every meeting that I go to, when they have the sponsorship announcement, it is if you've worked all 12 steps and are willing to sponsor, please raise your hand. That's the dumbest shit I've ever even heard. Because the truth is that you can't even work a step if you're not working with others.
Mhm.
People don't understand that.
Yeah.
People think that they work the steps because they got this guy or this girl or this they them that basically gave them a reading assignment and then gave them a writing assignment and then they told them to read them that reading writing assignment and then if that writing assignment is thorough enough then they basically validated that they can move on to the next step, you
Yeah.
know. And that's kind of how people progress for, you know, until they get through 11 essentially, which sometimes takes 6 months to a year. And basically people are just delving into a fucking tedious exercise of self-knowledge, which doesn't do anything for you, and they're white knuckling it for a year, which you're not treating your mind and you're not treating your spirit. So you have a bunch of emotional manageability and you're buying into all your delusions. And they're hoping to like get some relief by hearing some fucking speaker meeting trauma dump for an hour. Like that's going to save them, you know, and lucky they get someone who's entertaining and funny. But, you know, a lot of sponsors are, and this is not their fault. And there was a time where I like resented it because I was like, when actually someone taught me the book, and it took me 9.5 years to actually have that experience, which to me is very indicative of why things are fucked up, right? Because in the beginning, I mean, they had word of mouth, but what they decided to do is once they found something that worked, they put it in a book, which maintained the integrity of the message and what this thing was about, you know? And so, um,
Yeah, there's a very specific set of instructions in that book, right?
well, yes, but like there's the other shit that's like not even necessarily in the absolute instructions, right? So at the end of the forward of the first edition, it says, we will be interested in hearing from people who are getting results from this book, particularly from those who commence work with other alcoholics. So if you bought your first edition, you get that forward, and that would be the first thing that you read. And that's literally at the end of that. And basically, what that sentence is saying is that we don't give a fuck what you have to say about the program. We don't care about your opinion if you're not working with others, because if you're not working with others, you're not working it, right? When we look back at the original 6-step program, the first step was complete deflation. What do we think we're deflating is self, right? So a selfless practice needs to be implemented if we're going to deflate self, right? And then it's dependence and guidance on higher power, right? So, you know, coming up with a concept of higher power, this is the other thing, dude. You know, you go to the meetings and you'll hear someone say, oh, yeah, you know, higher power can be a doorknob. Why don't you pick a doorknob? Or if you're wondering if there's a higher power, just go out in the ocean and stop a wave, right? But if I'm in a lot of emotional pain and I'm like stressing out, the last thing I want to do is talk to a doorknob or try to go to the ocean, have a wave pummel me. So I'm like drowning and covered in sand. Like I need to have a higher power, or at least a concept that is rooted in some sort of logic, right? And that logic to me is needs to be rooted in like, how do I want to feel? Because if the whole purpose of this program is to have an experience with God, right? And my experience with life is rooted in how I think about it and how I feel about it, then really in coming up with that initial concept of God, which of course evolves through the practice, is really just asking myself, how do I want to feel as I exist in life, no matter what's happening in life? And every single person that I ask that question to is the same answer, pretty much. It's some sort of peace. They just want to feel at peace. And the kind of God that I would need to, or anyone that I know with a logical brain would need to believe in to feel at peace, is just an unconditionally loving God, something that's taking care of them at all times and wanting the best from them at all times, you know? So, um, there's just a lot of suggestions, I think, in the fellowship that are really fucked up. You know, even in Bill's story, it talks about, you know, how we perfect and enlarge our spiritual life is through work and self-sacrifice for others. It doesn't say praying and meditating. And even in like the history of AA, you know, when the shit is hitting the fan for Bill in Akron, you know, and like he is thinking about drinking, which I don't even think that really even touches what he must have been feeling. I would have been like, fuck you, God, where's mine? I've been working with all these people for the last 6 months. You can't even give me a job. Like, fuck off, right? So the miracle of that moment is that he suddenly realized in order to save himself, he must carry the message to another alcoholic. It doesn't say in order to save himself, he must call a sponsor. He must go to a meeting. He must write an inventory. He must write a gratitude list. He must decorate a God box or hit his knees. It says work with others. So, I mean, literally, this whole program was rooted in altruism. In the doctor's opinion, nothing has contributed more to the rehabilitation of alcoholics than the altruistic movement growing up among them. So, even Dr. Silkworth, who'd been working with drug addicts and alcoholics for 40 years on a hopeless venture, like nobody was getting sober, what he saw was that it wasn't people getting better so they could help people. It was people helping people so they got better.
Yeah.
So this idea of like, oh, I do this writing and reading with a sponsor, and then I get better from like some clarity or whatever. And now I'm going to go and help people. Like, that's where it's all fucked up. So
Yeah.
people just aren't living the solution. They don't even know what it is, and people think that the step work is like a, a writing exercise when really we're in a book club. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I remember some old timers in any when the step working guide came out, and this is pretty controversial. I say to them, well, guys, what do you think about this? And this, because I was like 2, 3 years clean when it came out, and they said, there's a lot of therapeutic psychobabble in it.
Yeah, totally.
That's completely stuck with me, because I think the influence of the culture, and of course God works in mysterious ways, and for identification purposes, God has, all there's over 200 12-step fellowships now, by the way, like over 200.
Crazy.
Yeah,
Totally.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So like, you'll get stuff like Under Earners Anonymous, Over
Right.
Over Earners Anonymous.
But like the more it veers away from just the simplicity of like help another person,
Yeah,
more it gets weird. And exactly what you're saying, it's become like a almost a therapeutic process. Even Big Book Awakenings, I don't know if you guys have that out there, but it's basically like a deep dive into the big book where you do line by line. You basically turn everything into a question, and it's a whole in-depth process which for some reason I did that and missed work with others, right? And also, who the fuck is going to be able to replicate that? Yeah,
yeah,
I'm going to be able to sponsor people and like whatever, but I'm talking about the new guy with a day of sobriety. That fool's not going to be able to do that shit. So it's like giving something that a person with a day of sobriety can do and
yeah.
pass on is literally the most
Yeah.
effective thing.
That was so important to me when I first came about because, the whole victim mentality and the whole powerlessness aspect of it, I needed to feel like I had some sort of purpose and some sort of
Totally.
willingness, like I had to be able to pass on. And somebody told me, you've got 3 days, you can help somebody who's not got a day yet. And I was like, oh, I was on fire with that idea, that was so important to me staying well, that I had something to give because I felt so purposeless and, like you, like a piece of shit. I'd felt like a piece of shit since I was a kid. So yeah, it's so vital to my well-being today. It's still so vital to, how I live my life today it's everything. I just want to be a service full stop.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the message that I carry is really like if you're new, you have power. If you're new, you have purpose. Like, don't let these fucking old timers or like new old timers or whatever the fuck they are infantilize you and
Yeah.
tell you that you need to sit down and shut the fuck up. Like, get a book. You don't have to carry your message, carry the message. It's simple, right?
There's a
Um,
whole paradox in that powerlessness in that first step that gives you real power. Yeah.
Right. Well, and the other thing is, people pull lines like you can't transmit something you haven't got, but like if you have a book, you got it. You just need to know how to read, you know? So yeah, it's really wild. So I think that that's really what's destroyed the success rate. But again, the success rate that I think we're getting, the percentages are not coming from any 12-step fellowship because that shit's anonymous. It's coming from treatment centers, right? Because they're the only places that would have statistics. And treatment is fucking bullshit. Even if they call themselves a 12-step treatment center, if it's not happening in a 12-step fellowship, it's certainly not happening in a treatment center. I don't know a treatment center that's basically sitting down with guys in treatment or girls in treatment or theys in treatment and like opening up the book with them and teaching them how to teach the book and then having them teach the other people in treatment the book. Like they're not doing that, right? They're
Yeah.
taking them to some 12-step meetings and giving them a bunch of therapy and like trying to get to their fucking trauma because, Gabor Mate said fucking trauma is the root of addiction when there's a shit ton of people who've got trauma in the world who aren't addicts at all because they don't have the fucking allergy. But people
Yeah.
want to like hone in on this victim bullshit. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Sorry.
it was so no, I don't apologize because I think there's a lot of usefulness in what Gabor Mate says around like the ACEs stuff influencing, people's need to medicate, but it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning about the allergy, like that will be what defines whether or not you need to lead a life of abstention. Like I had to have a life of abstention before I could heal the trauma. So there's no absolutes here. The only absolute for me is, do you have this allergy?
Totally.
And everything else can be worked around and navigated. But if you have this allergy, this is what I need to tell you, you know, and
Sure.
it's in the rest of this book. So yeah, I think there's been a lot of useful discussion from people like Gabor Mate or Vassar Banderkolk, like the sort of body keeping the score around trauma, but it's not what makes you an addict, like because many people have that extreme trauma and don't become addicts, and many people become addicts who don't have that extreme trauma. So I think, like you said, there might be various motivations from treatment centres, insurance companies, all of that. And I do think some people need, in order to get a break from the allergy, the mental obsession and the physical allergy, they do have to be taken out of society and put in an environment where they don't have access to that. So I do value what rehabs do, but like you said, they're often not going through what's laid out in the book. They're not showing, they're not focusing on the stuff that will keep us well. And I think you're right to say, like, the stats, around, what we know as success rates will be based on maybe a few treatment centres or limited research we have around treatment centres rather than, who is going through the book and going through the book in the way that it's intended. I
Yeah.
certainly I certainly know from my own experience, I think I was given what you're talking about, although there was times where my sponsor asked me to go away and read stuff, and then we came back together and read it together. So, that she did ask me to like underline any questions or stuff that I never identified with, and then there was a discussion. So we did go through it page by page, but there is a for me, and I do that with sponsors as well. I will ask them to read it first, and then we'll come together, because it's helpful for me, and I can only pass on what I've been given as well, but. I've not used alcohol or other drugs, and I've not had to use any other real, I've not fell down any of the traps of other addictions, other obsessive compulsive behaviors since I got clean and sober, So I think there's a lot to be said for that. And there's so many traps that people can fall down once they get free from substances, right? So many other obsessive compulsive behaviors that can lead to endless loops of despair and not using drugs.
Yeah, totally. I don't have anybody read the book on their own at all anymore. I think it's because of like that textbook line, and it was just explained to me like it has to be taught. And also, I want to give everybody like a chance, and I know time is of the essence because like everyone just has this small window of opportunity in terms of willingness, right? So for me, I think asking people to read 164 pages and then coming back to me, I think I would just lose like so many people just with that, And granted, I understand like some people implement that's ideology, I think, for willingness or whatever. But to me, every single person that I get to work with is actually my opportunity to practice being a blessing. So whatever I can do to make it easier for someone to want to work with me, I'm totally down to do. Like I don't care
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, the way that I was shown was it was page 1 to 60 first, so it was split up into chunks, much smaller chunks after steps 1 and 2, which is, page 1 to 60. Um, But yeah, everybody's showing it differently, aren't they? And like I said, I do then go through each page individually. But I think for me as well, I remember trying to read the big book in those first few weeks of getting sober, and I would start at the top of the page, get to the bottom of the page, and go, "What have I just read?" And I would have my, my brain was so fried, that would have to maybe read it 3 or 4 times before I took any of it in. So that's why I knew the value of then going and reading it with my sponsor. And it was like, we were present, we were physically with each other, we were, the questions that could come up with each paragraph, you
Yeah,
know.
totally. I was the same. I mean, I used to blame it on ADHD actually, is because I could read a paragraph 3 times over and not get it. But I think that was the benefit of like, yes, going into a deep dive into each sentence and paragraph with the person who took me through the book, but then having somebody that I was passing on what I was just taken through that day, and then the next day and the next day and the next day, and then 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, that really allowed me to retain the information and start to understand it from not only my perspective and the dude who was taking me through it, but all these different people's perspective. And it also was like really entertaining, which keeps me wanting to do it because it's not so much about, again, like the text itself. It's really about the conversation because the book's, a connector. That's really what it is. And
Yeah. So tell me, you've been clean sober a long time then. Just tell me a wee bit about your life today and what it, apart from, all the working with others. I mean, it probably is all of that. 90% of your life will be all of that. I get that. But tell me about the external circumstances of your life.
Uh, well, for about 15 years is 15 years of my sobriety. It is getting late.
Sorry. Yeah.
I was DJing and producing music and traveling the world and doing that. And I lived in Bali for about 7 years. And um, I think right around COVID, I just saw the world in like such unrest. And I was living in Bali and I was like living in a paradise island. And I was just seeing people panicking all over social media and just really recognizing at the time like the human condition aspect of this whole thing, and really separating the allergy as the one thing that identifies um, me as an alcoholic or an addict and all the other stuff, is actually what I'm treating through this selfless practice. And I was speaking on a 12-step meeting on Zoom during the pandemic, and I shared about something that I have written in my big book that was taught to me. It's this thing that says, if I really understand who I am, I, the light of God, my spirit will be joyful at all times, which was a very powerful thing for me to write down. And then it's just only gotten deeper ever since. And people misunderstood me when I was sharing and they thought that I'd written a book. So I started getting all these messages in the chat of like, where can I find your book? And I'm like, I didn't write a book. Um, I was talking about my big book. And I always kind of listen to these things as like signs from the universe. And I was like, oh, maybe I should write a book. And then I just kind of tabled that. And then a good friend of mine in Bali, this young DJ kid, he wound up killing himself on New Year's shortly after that. And he was not an alcoholic or an addict. And I just thought, man, if he only had a fucking practice. And then I started thinking about all the people in my life who are not alcoholics and not addicts who came to me at different parts of my life who wanted to have a practice. And I was like, I should really write this book. And so I sat down and wrote a book for non-alcoholics and non-addicts. That's basically it's modeled after the same concept of how I was taught the big book. So it's basically you have to read it with people, and you have to read it with as many people as you possibly can because it's a selfish practice in that way. So like it's called the spiritual revolution. So it's rooted in spiritual principle or unconditional love or selfless practice. Um, but it has nothing to do with allergy. It's all human condition stuff. So it's all mental obsession, all spiritual malady, which I think that everybody, suffers from on some sort of spectrum. So, the book, like, I guess in the smallest sense, is something that people can mend relationships with by reading with each other and, gaining more perspective in terms of like the people that they might have some resentment against or whatever, because they actually build some intimacy, or in intimate relationships, really figuring out who the person is that you're in a relationship with, and like having a practice to continue that intimacy. Also, I think selflessness can heal a lot of mental health stuff. So people want to explore having a practice while they're doing meds. And if they decide to get off meds, having a practice that they can do without meds. And I also wanted to write something for people who want to do mushrooms sometimes, and the non-alcoholic and the non-addict who can do stuff. So really, give the world a practice, and then like the full extent of all of it. Because if we're really practicing unconditional love and selflessness, then we're living in a world with like no borders and everyone united and everybody understanding that their divine purpose on this earth is to be the blessing and to follow government and the monetary system and complete anarchy, but peace. So I don't know if I'm going to be alive to see that, but basically, my wife and I have opened up a private practice. So we've been working with a lot of non-alcoholics and non-addicts, mostly couples, and then some single people too, and basically teaching people how to teach the book, which is way more user friendly than the big book because it's written in plain language, and I built in all the questions in there. But we do that privately, and then I also work in an IOP, and I run a group there on the book, and then I just do like some public speaking shit, and you know that's
What's
it.
an IOP?
IOP is a intensive outpatient program.
Oh, okay, right, yeah.
Yeah, it's I don't know how intense it is, but the IOP that I work at is actually very ethical. Otherwise, I wouldn't be working there because I've walked away from treatment centers that were not. So
Yeah. Yeah. We've started to build something in the UK called MCAT, the Ethical Marketing and Addiction Treatment Standards. There's so many snake oil salesmen and
um,
unethical practices. So yeah, I think our sector, our field is very embryonic, isn't it, right? And we've got a lot to learn. But yeah, the essence of what will help us recover is, it's very specific. It's there. Um, but I love the idea of taking the knowledge that you've learned and taking that out to a much wider audience, a more receptive audience, and making it more palatable as well. I think there's been some great instances of some of that being done where, celebrities who are in recovery who have wrote books and stuff as well, like they can carry the message or carry a message of service, um, and help people understand and remove some of the stigma around addiction, but also that you're talking about the human condition and how, we live in such our cultural and material world is so dominant that, to live a life of service is seen as somehow, like it's only monks and nuns that do that, right? When actually, no, you,
yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's like if you think about people complaining about nepotism and that being what rules the world. I mean, part of the reason I was not the best DJ in the world, but I played at some of the biggest shows with the biggest artists and toured with sports franchises, not because I was the best DJ, but because I was kind. And I've
yeah,
serviced to every single person that I met along the way, and people wanted to lift me up. So if people understand that like monetary and material gain can be had in a practice of unconditional love, and also while you're like achieving those things, you can actually live at peace
yeah.
rather than being satisfied with anything that comes your way, like why not take that? So yeah,
That's real currency, isn't it? The
I,
kindness, the love, that's proper currency.
I think so too. And also, I think what really separates my book from other books, because I know, other celebrities have done that shit too, but the book is not just conceptual, it is the practice. And yeah, I mean, you have to give it away. Like that's how it's read. And I've seen people who try to not give it away and it fucks them up. It's not a light book. It gets pretty deep. So
Yeah.
it's just, yeah, self.
Michaelis, just before we finish, you sort of touched on a couple of things there. You made reference to the sort of state of the world today and whether or not we'll be alive to see what looks like is coming. But I have great hope because the last time the world was in such a terrible state, like the depression, the 1920s and the 1930s, Alcoholics Anonymous was born out of that. And necessity is the mother of all inventions. So I have great hope that the darkness that is currently enveloping the world and many aspects of what people see, that's my world doesn't feel dark, but I can see why it looks dark. Um, I have great hope that, there will be another spiritual revolution, to name your book, another spiritual revolution comes from that darkness. I think it's nature abhors a vacuum. It must, as night follows day,
Yeah,
light follows darkness, right?
totally. And I have hope too. And I didn't mean it like that. I meant it more like, I don't know if I'm going to live to see it because I'm getting older. But
Yeah.
yeah, I would not have written the book if I didn't think that it could live out its full extent. And I'm trying, this is not like an arrogant statement, but I do think that the book that I wrote could be like the catalyst of a complete trajectory change of humanity if, people just pick it up and do what it needs to be done. So,
Well, listen, you send me a link to that book where people can buy it, and I will put it in the comment section underneath the YouTube video of you and I talking. And thank you so much for staying up so late. I know it's like 1:30 in the morning now where you are, so I appreciate your tiredness. I appreciate
so
your
much.
time.
I really appreciate you too. Thank you. This is a really good conversation.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you.